back in May, and it was at the time about proposed rules and regulations. And I think there were three major articles or three major tenets of the proposed regulations that were contained in here. I'm not sure how many of you read it. It's a massive recommendation. It's over 700 pages long. But there were three themes in here that were probably worth talking about today. The first is that the Chief Risk Officer of the institution should report directly to the CEO. There should be a risk management committee within the organization, and that there are minimum academic and professional standards that both the Chief Risk Officer and board committee members should attain and have. I think the first of these two, that the Chief Risk Officer should in fact report to the CEO, is a pretty sound recommendation and something we've been talking about for quite some time. The Chief Risk Officer needs both implied and explicit authority really to kind of carry out their job. And reporting to the CEO is one of the ways to obtain that. The second item here is that there needs to be a risk management committee within the institution. I think the right answer here is that it depends. As the organization becomes more complex, and just think of your own knowledge of your organization and how well you know how products and services are, all the products and services are delivered. And I think the greater your knowledge of that, in all likelihood, you probably have an organization that is, leaning on the scale of a little bit more simple. And to the extent that there may be parts of the organization that are not familiar, then the organization may be a bit more complex. And again, with complexity, I think it is reasonable for the risk committee to begin to be broken away from other technology operations, audit, compliance, ALCO, those sorts of committees, and actually to kind of stand on its own. The guidance, or I should say the proposed rules here, really do talk about the complexity with respect to what governance structures need to be. The third item here is a recommendation around minimum academic and professional acumen for the Chief Risk Officer and the board members is somewhat problematic for us. Nobody was born or went to college thinking that they aspire to be a Chief Risk Officer. At least I don't think any of the folks on the phone right now have, which means that all of us have kind of grown into this. And I can lend my voice quite confidently here that when I was in college, I had absolutely no vision that I was going to spend the rest of my career in risk management. We have all moved from various careers and functional roles into this space, and that we are probably a decade away from having enough people in the industry with enough acumen to be able to fulfill those roles. So I'm not sure how this particular element of the proposed rule would actually be enacted, but it does seem a little bit off with respect to where the current state of the industry is right now. And if it's a goal, great, but it wasn't written to say that this should be a goal. It was stated as we should do this now. So those are the three main provisions, something for you to think about. What I would like you to consider is the fact that this is the tone and tenor that is beginning to creep into not only the agencies, but a lot of the rulemaking. And that's why I have a strong belief, as well as everybody here at Wilson Company, enterprise risk management is likely to have some legs, and it is likely to be important for quite some time, both to the industry and to your institution. The goal, though, of the enterprise risk management program, should be clear. There are so many threats out there, and this picture here, think of a highway here, and that each one of these vehicles on this highway represents a threat to your organization. Your risk management program, if implemented well, would have the ability to evaluate each of these threats, and most importantly, figure out which is the one threat or few threats that could truly jeopardize your franchise. That's the one that the Risk Management Committee and the Chief Risk Officer needs to ensure is vetted within the executive management team and the board. Okay? Everything else that could possibly occur to your organization, every threat that could really, truly impact the organization after the 5 or 6, 10 threaten the franchise, everything else will just hurt, meaning that it'll be expensive, or it may create some cost to the organization. But you can survive that. The franchise is not at risk. So what about the approaches to ERM? What types of policies forget to ask here is $334,000, or even, as I mentioned before, maybe it's $500,000 for this organization, is that enough? And what I can add to that is, I'm not sure. It's a number. 334 here is a number, and what will become much more valuable to us is to understand, what did we spend last year? What are we spending and planning on spending next year? We know that our business model and the business around us changes. We know that the regulatory environment around us is changing. Is 334 enough to keep the institution safe and sound? And again, for today's purposes, it's a bit rhetorical, but if this was your institution and we had just calculated that, it would have that question, and the answer would be pretty significant. So now we get to the third pillar, third leg of the wooden stool, and we talked about governance. Not so long ago, a very traditional governance structure for, again, community-based institution might look something like this. 3 or 4 working committees of the board of directors, 5, possibly 6 or so working committees at the management level, with the audit piece, both internal audit and external audit, kind of sitting, from an official reporting line, somewhat outside that, but clearly administratively that it sits within it. This is probably insufficient as we look forward for organizations, except for some of the very smallest. What is likely to start to emerge, and what's a model that we endorse, especially as this enterprise risk management program get off the ground, is to strongly consider a governance structure where the risk committee, and it says enterprise risk committee here, but basically risk committee may begin to include a couple of members of the executive management team as well as the board. What's important here is not that it's become a final governance structure, but as a way to move the organization in the right direction at the right speed. Speed is going to be determined based on the people that you have and how comfortable everybody is in some of the basic tenets of risk management. And I'm including both the senior management team as well as the board members. There's education that is evolving and continuing. The volume of education out there in enterprise risk management industry-wide is about as high as I've ever seen it. What I don't know is this the high water mark, or is it likely to grow even further? What I do know for sure is that the appetite and desire for board-level training is about as high as I can ever remember it in my 10 years here at Wolf & Company. We are now being asked to participate in strategic planning sessions almost once a month. Okay, and to me, that's a sign that this is a topic that's incredibly important to the board, both for their understanding, but also for a much deeper, more working-based knowledge. So this is where I think many organizations are now, but there are some that have clearly moved past this. And what they have moved past is if you look on the right side at both the board level and at the executive management level, is that there is a risk committee both at the management and at the board level. Okay, this is what the ABA magazine reported on the proposed Fed rule changes. Okay, this likely exists in some of the I know this exists in some of the largest money center institutions. Okay, we know it is moving into regional-based financial institutions. I'm talking about institutions with assets between $10 and $50 billion. Okay, this is actively being contemplated, if not actually being launched. What will become interesting is will this type of committee structure ever be required at more community-based institutions, below $5 billion. I don't have an answer for that question today. A year from now, this will probably become a lot more clear. This was the essence of what the Fed's rule changing was made. The problem, as I mentioned before, is there aren't enough people with the professional and academic acumen to fully staff these committees, clearly at a community-based institution. But again, 10 years ago, most community-based institutions didn't have a chief risk officer, and today we know that's a much different story. So let's talk about the stages of the risk management programs. One of the things, if you allow me to introduce this slide this way, one of the things we launched about 2 months ago was a research study to understand where are the chief risk officers in community-based institutions coming from. Nobody went to college for this. Okay, we have all professionally, or I should say the risk officers are professionally migrating to this role. The other piece of research that's doing kind of similar track is understanding what is the point of inflection for the financial institutions to decide to launch and fund the chief risk officer role. It is an expansion of the executive management team, and clearly the business and regulatory environment has supported such a change. But what is that point? When is the line crossed? It cannot be just as simple as, well, when we get to $1 billion in assets, we're going to add the Chief Risk Officer to our executive leadership team. We've clearly observed that institutions that are smaller than that have gone ahead and added this role. So one of the pieces from this research, and again, it's a very early observation. We're right in the middle of it. Hopefully we will finish it up in the fall. But one of the things that emerges, and was pointed out to me as well, is that there are 3 stages that the institution goes through. There's compliance ERM, integrated ERM, top-to-bottom ERM. The compliance ERM really is characterized by the institution's desire to begin to build the enterprise risk management program simply because the federal banking regulators have asked that you do something, okay? And what tends to happen is that a member of the senior management team begins to take responsibility for information security, regulatory compliance, BSA, maybe internal audit, but again, only from an administrative perspective, those sorts of things. Fold them in underneath the umbrella. But not everything gets folded in. Credit, ALCO, IRR, that tends to stay outside, some of those initial efforts, okay? But at the second level, that integrated ERM, they begin to everything gets folded in underneath the Chief Risk Officer. So the Chief Risk Officer may not chair credit committee, but the Chief Risk Officer becomes a voting member of that committee, clearly participating in understanding what the interest rate risks are and what the liquidity strategies are for the institution, and taking a very active role in that, as well as ensuring that information security and privacy programs and the risk assessments themselves are being conducted regularly, and the results are thorough and make sense for the organization. At the integrated ERM, the enterprise risk assessment dashboard, that heat map that I keep referring to and we've shown a couple of times here, that becomes very important as a way of measuring and monitoring resource allocations into the enterprise risk management program. And all of that, including the beginning of the governance, the launching of more sophisticated governance structures, they begin to emerge and take footing in this integrated ERM stage, this second stage. So then we move, the next logical place to go here is top to bottom ERM. And what gets added or layered on here is strategic planning. The links between strategic planning and enterprise risk management are incredibly strong, and when done well, the enterprise risk management program should actually create some boundaries for the strategic planning process. If the risk appetite, and I'm going to get to this concept of risk appetite here in a little bit, but if the institution's desire to take on some risk by getting into some new business products, there seems to be a lot of energy around doing this. Well, the risk appetite should help define some boundaries as to whether this is something we are going to do. Now, risk appetite is not static. It's a little bit more fluid. It can change in time. The risk DNA of a financial institution can also change over time. We would contend that it shouldn't happen by accident. There should be a full understanding that if there are some new initiatives that are coming out of strategic planning, that the impact on the institution's risk appetite, risk profile, risk DNA as we refer to it, that those are all still somewhat contained, and that during the planning process it is clear what risks are we taking on, and of all of them, which risks can kill the institution because everything else will just hurt.
All right, we do have a poll for our audience. At which stage do you believe your institution is at in your risk management program based on what Mike just went over in the previous slide? So I'm going to open the poll to the audience now, and if you guys would mind answering one of the three, that would be great. We'll just leave it open for a few more seconds. Okay, it looks like 61% are in the compliance ERM stage, 27% are in the integrated ERM stage, and 11% are at the top to bottom ERM stage.
1% didn't vote. Let's move on. Case study. Ashley introduced early on the number of financial institutions we work with on a regular basis, and it's well over 200 at this point. And what we try to do from time to time is kind of share some of those experiences, because we know, you know, some of the best learning and best understandings can come from your peers. That's why it's such an important case studies and presentment of case studies is such an important element during our annual user conference. But at least let me share with you now a particular governance structure that we worked with one of our clients. This was a situation that occurred approximately about 18 months ago at this point. The management team. The management team was clearly looking for some sort of an enterprise risk management program. They weren't sure what it was, but they knew they had some idea of what they wanted to get out of it. They needed to improve customer services. They needed to increase decision making, kind of at the line management level, and they needed the program to go way beyond current capabilities that existed with both credit and liquidity. But like any new idea, there are always some opposing forces. And this was an organization where the CEO saw no real potential value in doing this. This is a 4-decade, CEO had been in the banking industry for almost 4 decades, knew his institution, knew what it took to be successful, and didn't quite see how he fit in. This is also a time where the volume of board reporting with respect to risk assessments and audits and compliance issues was at an all-time high, and clearly the board was not asking for additional information, additional reporting. You're going to make the board meeting longer? Really? I mean, it was tough. But there was this underpinning in there with respect to the safety and soundness exams, and what the regulators were saying is, you need to do something, and we do have an expectation that you will do something the next time we visit. I'm not sure if that sounds familiar to some or to everyone, but clearly this is what existed at this organization. Some of the early things that the organization did is one senior manager opted into the CRO role. And for those of you who ever volunteer for things, that you can understand that this was a big leap of faith professionally for this individual. They also ensured that they centralized the day-to-day oversight of the risk assessment activities with the Chief Risk Officer. What I talked about before with respect to risk management operations, we weren't using that terminology at this time, but this is what we mean. Also, that the CRO was given authority to override line managers. The essence of this comment and this observation is that effective risk management does not need to be a democracy. Okay, that does not mean that there's not a team approach to it, and it certainly doesn't mean that we take an authoritative approach to it, but at some point in time, somebody has to make a call on what their belief of the inherent risks are to the organization, and truly how strong are our controls. What happened within the organization pretty quickly is that line management began to ask themselves, how do we do business, and do we really do it this way? The executive team was absolutely shocked at what they learned with respect to things that the organization was not doing or was not doing well. Looking into certain areas and finding that there are no policies and procedures, and if that is truly the case, it was amazing that we hadn't lost any money yet. Okay, proactive decision making. What also began to happen quite clearly is that the line managers wound up being able to think through the implications of some of their operational decisions from a risk perspective, and it also means from a potential loss perspective, and change their behavior and change their thinking long before programs, new management practices were fully implemented. What happened about 6 to 12 months after this initial effort was that the reporting of the CRO to the CEO became fixed. And again, consistent with what we're seeing today in the paper, again, 18 months ago, this may have been, kind of a big leap forward. The Chief Risk Officer did maintain the authority to override line management. It worked both in that pilot phase, and it was becoming a key success factor for the program overall. And what happened on the board level was nothing short of really fascinating. More junior members of the management team were brought in from time to time to present what was happening from a risk assessment or risk management within their particular areas. And what the leadership, the senior management team leadership group did not understand is that the board actually loved it. They loved hearing from the folks that were actually directly responsible for the work that was being done. And they colluded among themselves without the knowledge of the senior management team to make sure that at the end of the presentation somebody on the board always asked, what else don't we know? And I think that was an indication of content that was presented to them in a crisp format, also in a format that was relevant to the board's job. And it took over 6 months for the senior leadership to realize that one member of the board, before the meeting started, they had all agreed among themselves who was going to ask this question. I think one of the more profound aspects of this, and this is an actual quote from the Chief Risk Officer, is that the board understood and management agreed that if there are no red categories, there are no profits. Red categories occur in that heat map when the inherent risk is high, or when it has been agreed upon that there are certain areas of banking operations where 50 controls are just not going to be implemented, and therefore the control environment may be weak with only 2, but it warrants only two controls. And again, this is a real break from a lot of traditional thinking that says, no, we may have to make sure that our control environment is strong to keep us safe. Strong control environments are important for the areas that have the highest threats to the organization. Money wire transfer needs to be strong. There are elements of branch operations that may not need to be. The right answer is going to depend institution to institution, but hopefully that statement doesn't violate anybody's sensibilities here today. So what happens with the role of the Chief Risk Officer and the Chief Internal Auditor? This is something that is continuing to emerge, and I would describe it today as a healthy level of professional antagonism. The Chief Internal Auditor, let me say it with a story. In 2011, we received about 4 or 5 different phone calls from our clients indicating that the federal regulators had left and the Chief Internal Auditor, as well as the Audit Committee Chair, had just been significantly criticized because there was a break in continuity between the work of the risk management function and the risk and the activities of the internal auditor. The risk management function was developing the risk assessments, identifying the key threats, documenting the key controls, and during that risk assessment process, we're finding areas of control remediation that truly need to be fixed. Almost universally in these 4 or 5 instances, the Chief Internal Auditor was conducting a separate risk assessment to help define both the breadth and depth, the scope of the internal audit procedures, which is a fancy set of phrases for saying the internal auditor was doing their own risk assessment to decide what to test that year. That is an example where there is a break in continuity, and that our recommendation, and clearly that of the examiners at the time, was that these 2 roles need to be more tightly integrated. The Chief Internal Auditor cannot report to the Chief Risk Officer for any length of time. The general principle that that audit must be independent of management, I think, is going to survive this discussion over the next couple of years. And I have seen a lot of discussion on a lot of online blogs about how these 2 roles interact, and I am amazed at internal auditors who want to construct models, where this independence, kind of rule is violated. I think that the internal auditor is going to have to report to the chair of the audit committee no matter what. However, I do believe that the internal audit gets to validate management's assertion of what the threats are to the organization and how strong the controls are. This is where the healthy antagonism, I believe, can exist, and I don't believe that it should ever take on a personal nature. It should always be professional. Clearly, the objective is to ensure the organization is running safely. I also think a lot of Chief Risk Officers need to be prepared, and to say encouraged would be a little strong, but to think as any operating department within the organization, internal audit may want to come in and understand the processes that are put in place to measure and monitor the risks and the threats, and to ensure that those processes are sound, have segregation of duties, have proper management review, and those sorts of things. I haven't seen or observed, an internal auditor taking that on, but I think in some of our clients, we know that it is likely to become within the audit scope within the next 12 to 18 months. The Chief Risk Officer's role here is clearly to manage all facets of risk management operations, try to ensure that the risk management finance piece begins to get developed and that there's an understanding of where the resources to the organization are being spent, and needs to lead the governance process, at least within the senior management team, and in all likelihood needs to report directly to the board of directors on what their belief of the key threats to the franchise are going to be. So allow me here in the last few minutes to kind of divulge back into risk appetite, because here is an area that is about as nebulous as any within the enterprise risk management space. Again, simple definition. There's a lot of words on this slide, but simply put, Risk appetite is really about stating how much risk the franchise is willing to take. Will you launch, a whole C&I loan portfolio? Will you get into that type of lending if you've never done it before? Your risk appetite statement should have some elements to say what types of lending products you are going to get. And then I know credit policy talks about the relative percentages of the portfolio and that sort of thing. So I'm not trying to get into credit policy here, but risk appetite would say that we are willing to begin to get into this. The question I would have is, have we thought through all the threats about getting into that type of an activity as an example, and which types of threats, if they occur, would actually kill the franchise? The CEO, in helping set that, is really beginning to set who we are as an institution. And who we are is a synonym for this is our brand. This is what our customers should expect from us when they do business with us. The CRO's responsibility in creating the risk appetite is to understand and be able to tease it out of the statement, and most importantly, be able to articulate that to the board, the rest of the management team, as well as to the employees. Okay? It is a joint proposition, and in some respects, when an institution doesn't have a chief risk officer, I think the CEO is the de facto chief risk officer. There are certain decisions of such a magnitude because of the risk to the bank or the credit union that they're going to go up to the office of the CEO to be decided. And when that's the case, many times that's what the chief risk officer is doing. A little bit more on risk appetite, just to introduce it. I'm not going to go reading through all this. I hate this program where the presenter reads all the slides, all the words on the slide, so I'm not going to do this. But what I am trying to do is kind of compare and contrast and really set some foundations of, what are the elements to it. I think most importantly, we're not writing a brand new mission statement. We're not coming up with complex ratings. We're not trying to create something that is static. Remember, we talk about the fact that the risk DNA of your institution can change over time. It should not change by accident. It should be done consciously as you begin to change your business profile. Changing your business profile likely means changing your risk appetite, and they should be done in concert. So here, nothing better than an example to kind of drive home a point. I have a risk appetite. Each of you individually has a risk appetite. And here are 4 ways that we begin to evaluate, or I can evaluate my risk appetite. And here, play along with me as I go through each of these. Personal safety, reputation, health, career development. I have certain things that I will do in each one of these areas, and I have certain things I will not do in each of these areas. And if I can articulate those, I will have articulated my risk appetite. It's just an example, personal safety. I want to make sure I do not have an accident while driving to work. I can tell you that when I was 16 years old, as opposed to how old I am now, I probably drove my car as you did with a slightly different level of safety and precaution. I have more at stake now than I may have done at an age when I felt completely indestructible. As I think of my reputation, okay, I have to become very conscious about what I may do in the areas of social media posts. Some people are so uncomfortable with what's going on, they won't participate at all. Other people are so comfortable that they post one, if not multiple times a day, okay? My level of interaction in social media, okay, is a function of how frequently I post is my level of comfort as well as my time, but also what I say. I am very conscious of the online reputation I create for myself. Nothing better than health. None of us gets enough sleep, none of us eats properly, and none of us gets enough exercise because we're all so busy, okay? I resemble that remark. I also fly a lot, so I'm also really conscious of, whether there's anybody in the seat next to me who may look like they've got Ebola, or some form of flu. I can't always control it, but at least I'm aware of it. And for many of us, and I'm not immune here as well, is career development. There are things that I do to continue my own personal and professional education, and that each of you do the same way. And I could articulate these, and I would write it down. That would become my risk appetite. And I suspect, and if one of you wanted to do this kind of offline for fun, you would write this down and you'd find out who you were. You may learn something about yourself along the way. And one of the things I can share with you is that almost every institution that we work with on any type of enterprise risk management program, whether it's Wolfpack or an advisory service, the institution and the executive team learn something about itself. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad. And if it's something that they don't like, at least they're now aware of it and they can fix it. Let's take this very simple statement. Okay, you can apply it to your organization, but what I'd like to do first is to tee up another poll.
Great. The question is, has your institution defined its risk appetite? So we're going to leave this open for a few seconds. If the audience can respond, please. Okay, great. 45% has said yes, and 55% has said no.
Well, okay. 55% have some work. That's okay. What is that? What is your risk appetite? What are the elements of your risk appetite start to have? This is how it begins to break down. There are elements of your risk appetite, or I should say there are areas within the risk appetite statement that legitimately, will address minimally these 4 areas, and you can read them as well as I can here. What's important to know is that there is no single metric that can define your risk appetite. We should not take a statement from each 4 of these things and define a singular risk appetite. What will happen is your risk appetite will define you as average, okay? And if we are all average, that tells us nothing, okay? It's important to understand that we have certain risk appetites in compliance that may be a little bit different from credit. We should keep them separate. We should measure them individually, but we should review them collectively because together they are who you are. So here, as we begin to wrap up, allow me to wrap up here with kind of another kind of real-life example, real-life story, and I'm going to introduce it this way. Could your most junior associate save your franchise? One of the principles that we talk about all the time is that the risk management program, a statement of risk appetite, needs to be developed in a way so that everyone from every member of the board of directors to the most junior associate in your institution understands how to do their job so that their areas of responsibility are performed safely and soundly. Okay? And here's a way of illustrating how that actually can come to life. One of my associates here and I visited an institution. We had never physically met the executive team, nor had we actually been to this location before. So we happened to walk into the institution. The corporate offices are joined with a branch. Okay, so we walk in the front door, not exactly sure where to go. So we stand there, right there on the inside for probably 10 seconds as we scan the lobby and the facility saying, okay, where do we go? So we find the corporate reception area all the way across. And clearly, this was an institution where 2 gentlemen walking in business suits with a black leather notepad are from out of town. So we walk up to the receptionist. We say, we're here to see the CEO. We have an appointment. My name is Mike. And they say, okay, please hold on right in a second while I confirm that you're supposed to come. Makes a phone call upstairs. Yes, we're there at the appointed hour, and they're sending one of the administrative assistants down to come get us. And the receptionist said, would you please sit right here? Administrative assistant comes, picks us up, brings us up to the executive suite. Once again, they're not all quite ready to meet with us. Deposits us in an area, and she says, would you please wait right in this place? I will be back in 2 minutes. And then sure enough, 2 minutes later, she comes and escorts us into the corporate offices. That is an experience that I am sure is not too different from what you may experience on a day-to-day basis within your organization. But allow me to break it down or look at it through a different set of lenses. We were clearly not customers of the institution because we were dressed differently than what normally would walk through. We were different. We were never left unescorted nor unattended at any point in time. It seems like a perfectly hospitable thing to do to guide us and escort us and make sure we're not alone, make sure we're comfortable. But from an information security perspective, we were never allowed in a non-public part of the institution until we were grabbed by an executive of the institution. We weren't allowed to walk into any areas of the branch. We weren't allowed to walk into any areas of the back office corporate areas. That we were in a designated spot, and some of the most junior associates of this organization knew that we were not to be left alone, not to be unescorted, and not brought into any sensitive area until a more senior manager or executive had personally escorted us there. And again, maybe we're a little jaded in our view of the world because of what we all do for a living, but it was immediately obvious while this was going on what their intention was beyond just being hospitable. So hopefully I've done this in a way that can illustrate that, and there are other ways that the most junior associates can understand your risk management program. The challenge that you have is to develop a lexicon that will be understandable to them. Those of you who know me pretty well, as I wrap this up, know that I'm a huge baseball fan. It's tough to be a baseball fan in Boston these days, but nonetheless, I am a baseball fan. And I like to use a baseball diamond to really as a quick analogy here just to kind of wrap this up. As you develop your enterprise risk management programs, one of the very first things you have to do, and you hear it often and often, and sometimes I hate hearing it too, but you have to assess the risk. You have to understand in a very holistic and a very comprehensive way, what are the threats to my organization? What controls have we put in place to keep us safe? The second place is you have to understand the difference between the threats that can kill you because everything else will just hurt. What is red? What are high-risk threats, even after the application of mitigating controls? We would also say, going back to this three-legged stool, that if the risk management operation is not of sufficient strength and maturity as finance and governance, in all likelihood, your enterprise risk management program, at best case, won't hurt you, but in all likelihood, you won't get out of it enough relative to the effort that you are putting into it. Our belief is that these concepts can easily be applied, from where many of them were developed, which are in the money center and the global institutions. I think they can be easily applied and done correctly with much more community-based institutions. So really, simply put, the ROI makes sense. And at the end of the day, I think a community-based institution can do it. It can become valuable to you. It can help you run the institution better. We don't believe it's a compliance issue. Don't believe it's just another management technique that's likely to pay off in a few years. It seems to be different than other things that have happened in my career. Hopefully, you have the ability to compare and contrast them from elements and projects you've worked on in your career. This feels different from a lot of perspectives, both from the public sector and private sector as well. So this is where I get to turn it back over to you. I've had the pleasure of sharing this with you for a little while, but now, Ashley, are there any questions?
There are not any questions, actually. So all of you in the audience, feel free to jot down Mike's contact information, which is up on the screen right now. And if you do think of any questions, you can definitely reach out to Mike at any time. And it's actually good because we're running a little over anyway, and Mike has a flight to catch to Virginia. So I want to thank the audience for attending today. And as a reminder, copies of this presentation are available at www.wolfpacksolutions.com/webinars. And then immediately following the conclusion of this webinar, you'll have the opportunity to complete a webinar survey. And as always, we appreciate your feedback so we can continue to improve our webinar program. And our next webinar will be held on Tuesday, August 21st on security, risks, and concerns surrounding mobile devices. So if you are interested in that, please just go to our website and you can register online. So thanks so much for attending. Mike, thanks so much for presenting today. And we look forward to your participation in future webinars. Have a great afternoon, everyone.